The fever came on the third day out of Lovelock, Nevada, and by the fifth day, Caroline Dawson could barely lift her head from the wagon floor where she lay shivering despite the scorching August heat of 1867. The wagon train had already lost 2 weeks to broken wheels and a flash flood that swept away half their supplies, and now the other families were gathering in tight circles, their voices low but urgent as they decided her fate. She could hear them through the canvas, each word a hammer blow against her already pounding skull. They were going to leave her behind. The journey to California was already perilous enough without nursing a sick woman who might be carrying something contagious. Her aunt and uncle, the ones who had reluctantly agreed to bring her west after her parents died, spoke the loudest about practicality and survival. Caroline had no husband, no children, no real claim on anyone's loyalty. She was 22 years old and utterly alone in the world. And now she would die that way too, abandoned somewhere in the Nevada wilderness. "We cannot afford to wait any longer." That was Samuel Hartford, the wagon master, his voice carrying across the camp. "Winter will catch us in the mountains if we do not move now." "But we cannot just leave her to die," a woman protested weakly, though even she sounded uncertain. "She has the fever. It could spread to all of us, to the children. We have to think of the greater good." Caroline closed her eyes and felt hot tears slide down her temples into her sweat-dampened hair. She wanted to be angry, wanted to rage against the injustice of it all, but she could barely muster the energy to breathe. Her whole body ached, her throat burned, and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision whenever she tried to sit up. Maybe it would be a mercy to just slip away here, to stop fighting against a world that seemed determined to grind her into dust. The vote was quick. 15 families, 15 votes. 14 voted to leave her behind with some water and supplies. Only one abstained, but that hardly mattered. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold, Caroline felt the wagon shift as someone climbed inside. She expected her aunt, perhaps come to offer some final empty comfort. But instead, she found herself looking up at a face she had seen only a handful of times during the journey. Delilah, one of the younger wives, knelt beside her with a wet cloth and a canteen. "I am so sorry," Delilah whispered, pressing the cloth to Caroline's burning forehead. "I begged my husband to vote differently, but he would not listen. They are all afraid." "It is all right," Caroline managed, her voice barely above a rasp. "I understand." But she did not really understand, not the kind of understanding that brought peace. She understood the logic, the cold calculus of survival, but her heart rebelled against being deemed expendable. They left her in the wagon with her trunk of belongings, 3 canteens of water, some dried meat and hardtack, and a pistol with 6 bullets. Her uncle had set the wagon beneath a cluster of scraggly trees near a dry creek bed, as if that small gesture could somehow absolve him of abandoning his dead sister's only child. He could not even meet her eyes as he said goodbye. "If you recover, head back east to Lovelock," he muttered. "It's only about 30 miles. Follow the creek bed." Then they were gone, the line of wagons rolling westward in a cloud of dust, and Caroline was alone with her fever and her fear in the vast, indifferent wilderness that stretched out in every direction. She drifted in and out of consciousness as the day faded into night. At some point she became aware of a strange sound, a rhythmic creaking that did not match the settling of the wagon or the whisper of wind through the sparse grass. Through her fever-addled mind, she thought perhaps death had come for her, and she found she did not have the strength to be afraid. But death, when it arrived, had a human face. The man who appeared in the doorway of her wagon was the largest human being Caroline had ever seen. He had to be well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the canvas opening. His hair was dark brown, sun-streaked and hanging past his shoulders, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that captured her attention through the haze of fever, pale gray eyes that assessed her with a combination of concern and calculation. "Easy now," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. "I'm not going to hurt you." Caroline tried to speak, to ask who he was, but only a weak croak emerged from her dry throat. The man moved into the wagon with surprising grace for someone so large, ducking his head beneath the canvas top. He wore buckskin pants and a worn leather vest over a homespun shirt, and a large knife hung at his belt alongside a powder horn and a possibles bag. Everything about him spoke of the mountains and the wild places beyond civilization. "Name is Dominic Garrett," he said, reaching for one of her canteens and lifting her head gently to help her drink. "I saw the wagon train pass through earlier, counted the wagons they had when they stopped near Lovelock last week. They are one short now." The water was like heaven against her parched throat. When she had drunk enough, he eased her back down and pressed his palm to her forehead, then her neck, checking for her pulse. Fever, but not as bad as it could be. No stink of infection, likely just exhaustion and exposure. He sat back on his heels, studying her. "They voted to leave you, did they not?" Carolyn managed a small nod. Something dark passed across his rugged features. "Cowards, every last one of them." He looked around the wagon, taking in her meager supplies. "This is not enough to get you anywhere, even if you could walk." "Why are you here?" Caroline whispered. "I live in these mountains," Dominic said, gesturing vaguely westward. "Come down to Lovelock every few months for supplies. Saw your wagon train heading out this morning and got curious when I noticed they had abandoned one wagon. Thought maybe it broke down, but when I got close enough to see it was set up like a camp, I figured someone was in trouble." "You should go," Caroline said, trying to inject some firmness into her weak voice. "I might be contagious." Dominic snorted. "I have had every fever known to man and probably invented a few new ones. You do not have anything that's going to kill me." He stood, his head brushing the canvas top. "I'm going to set up a proper camp. You need medicine and food, real food, not this hardtack nonsense." "Wait," Carolyn called, panic rising in her chest despite her weakness. "You cannot stay. The fever has already started breaking," Dominic interrupted. "You will be better in a day or two, especially once I get some willow bark tea and sage poultice into you. Then we will figure out what to do with you." He disappeared through the canvas opening, leaving Caroline alone with her confusion and a strange flutter of something that might have been hope. Over the next hours, as the stars emerged in the vast Nevada sky, Caroline drifted in and out of awareness. She was vaguely conscious of Dominic moving around outside, the sound of a fire crackling to life, the smell of something cooking that made her empty stomach clench with hunger. At some point, he returned with a tin cup full of bitter tea that he made her drink, supporting her shoulders with one muscular arm while she sipped. The strength in him was obvious, controlled power evident in every careful movement as he tended to her. "Sleep now," he murmured, easing her back down onto her bedroll. "I will be right outside if you need anything." Caroline wanted to protest, wanted to ask why a stranger would do this for her, but exhaustion dragged her down into darkness before she could form the words. When she woke, pale dawn light was filtering through the canvas, and her fever had broken. She was drenched in sweat, her dress clinging uncomfortably to her skin, but her head felt clearer than it had in days. The constant ache in her bones had faded to a dull throb, and when she carefully pushed herself up to sitting, the world stayed mostly stable around her. The smell of coffee drew her to the wagon's opening. Dominic sat by the fire, his back against a rock, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of pink and gold. He had a tin cup in one large hand and his rifle resting across his knees. Even at rest, there was a watchful quality to him, a readiness that spoke of years surviving in dangerous country. "You are awake," he said without turning around. "How do you feel?" "Better," Caroline admitted, her voice still hoarse. "Much better." "Good. There is water for washing in that basin by the wagon wheel, and I have breakfast cooking. Think you can keep down some salt pork and beans?" The mention of food made Caroline's stomach growl audibly, and she saw Dominic's shoulders shake with silent laughter. Embarrassed but too weak to care much, she carefully climbed down from the wagon, grateful that she had slept in her dress even if it was now thoroughly wrinkled and stained with sweat. The water in the basin was cool and clean, and Caroline used it gratefully to wash her face and hands, wishing she had the strength for a proper bath. She used her fingers to comb through her tangled blonde hair, managing to braid it into something resembling respectability before joining Dominic by the fire. In the daylight, he looked even more imposing. His shoulders strained against his shirt, muscles clearly defined even beneath the fabric. His forearms, bare where he had rolled up his sleeves, were corded with strength earned through hard labor. This was not a man who sat behind a desk or drove a wagon for living. This was someone who survived through physical prowess and intimate knowledge of the wilderness. He handed her a tin plate loaded with beans and salt pork, along with a piece of pan bread that was still warm from the fire. Carolyn accepted it gratefully and ate slowly, mindful of her empty stomach. "Thank you," she said after a few bites, "for everything. I would have died out here without your help." Dominic shrugged, sipping his coffee. "Could not leave you. It would not be right. Most people would have kept riding. I am not most people." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Caroline studied him when she thought he was not looking, trying to reconcile his rough exterior with the gentleness he had shown her. He had hands that could probably snap a man's neck without effort, but he had touched her with the careful tenderness of someone handling fine china. "What were you planning to do in California?" Dominic asked eventually. "Find work, I suppose. My aunt and uncle were going to set up a farm near Sacramento. I was hoping to work as a seamstress or perhaps a teacher until I could save enough to start over somewhere." Caroline pushed beans around her plate, appetite fading. "Not that it matters now. You could still go to California. Lovelock is not that far behind us. You could rest up there for a few weeks, see if another wagon train comes through heading west." Caroline considered this, but something cold settled in her stomach at the thought. "I have very little money left. Most of what I had went to my aunt and uncle for passage west. I could not afford to wait in Lovelock, and I certainly could not pay another family to take me on. What about going back east?" "To what?" The words came out more bitter than Caroline intended. "My parents are dead. We lost our farm 3 years ago after the war. I have no siblings, no other family. There's nothing for me back east." Dominic was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "So what will you do?" "I do not know," Caroline admitted, and the helplessness of her situation threatened to overwhelm her. She was alone, nearly penniless, stranded in the middle of Nevada with no clear path forward. The future that had seemed merely uncertain a week ago now looked absolutely bleak. "You could come with me." Caroline's head snapped up, certain she had misheard. "What?" "Come with me, to my cabin in the mountains." Dominic set down his coffee cup, his expression serious. "I have a place about 2 days north of here, up in the Ruby Mountains. It is not much, but it is solid and safe. You could stay there while you figure out your next move. Take some time to heal up properly and decide what you want to do." "I could not possibly impose on you like that," Caroline protested, even as a traitorous part of her heart leaped at the offer. "It is not an imposition. I have plenty of room and more supplies than I need for one person. You can help around the place if it makes you feel better about accepting help. I could use someone who knows their way around a needle and thread. My clothes are more patch than original fabric at this point." Caroline stared at him, searching for any sign of improper intent, but his expression remained open and honest. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Dominic was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. 5 years ago, I was sick with lung fever up in the mountains. A Shoshone family found me, took me in, nursed me back to health even though I was a white man, and they had every reason to leave me to die. The old grandmother told me that kindness is never wasted, even when it is hard, even when it costs us something. I have tried to live by that since then." There was a weight to his words, a sincerity that Caroline found herself believing, despite the strangeness of the situation. What choice did she have, really? She could try to make it back to Lovelock alone, weak and with limited supplies. She could attempt to reach California solo, which would almost certainly end in disaster, or she could trust this mountain man who had already saved her life once. "All right," she said finally. "I will come with you, but only until I am strong enough to make other arrangements. I do not want to be a burden." Something that might have been approval flickered in Dominic's eyes. "You will not be a burden. Now finish your breakfast. We will rest here today so you can regain your strength, then head out tomorrow morning. It is a hard ride to the cabin." "Ride? I do not have a horse. You will ride with me. I will rig a travois for your trunk and supplies. My horse is strong enough to carry double." Caroline felt her cheeks warm at the thought of riding pressed against Dominic's back for 2 days, but she pushed the feeling aside. This was about survival, nothing more. He was being kind, and she needed help. There was no reason to make it complicated. They spent the rest of the day in quiet activity. Dominic disappeared for several hours and returned with a rabbit and some wild onions, which he made into a stew that was the best thing Caroline had tasted in weeks. She mended a tear in his shirt while sitting in the shade of the wagon, finding comfort in the familiar task. Her strength returned gradually, and by evening she was able to walk around the camp without feeling dizzy. As night fell and they sat by the fire again, Caroline found herself studying Dominic across the flames. He was whittling something from a piece of wood, his large hands surprisingly dexterous. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw beneath his beard, the concentration in his eyes. "Can I ask you something?" Caroline said. "Of course. Why do you live alone in the mountains? Do you have family anywhere?" Dominic's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their work. "Had a family once, a wife. This was before the war, back in Missouri. She died of cholera in '62, along with our son. He was only 3 years old." "Oh?" Caroline's chest tightened with sympathy. "I'm so sorry." "After that, I could not stay. Everything reminded me of them. So I headed west, kept going until I found a place that felt right. Been in these mountains ever since." He glanced up at her. "What about you? You said your parents died. How long ago?" 2 years. My father died at Appomattox, one of the last casualties before the surrender. My mother followed him 6 months later. The doctor said it was pneumonia, but I think she just did not want to live without him." Carolyn wrapped her arms around herself. They loved each other very much. 30 years they were married, and they still looked at each other like newlyweds. "That is rare," Dominic said quietly. "Yes. I always hoped I would find something like that." Caroline laughed, but it sounded hollow. "Instead, I am 22, unmarried, and sitting in the Nevada desert with a stranger who saved me from dying alone." "You are only 22. You have plenty of time." "That is not how the world sees it. I am already past the age most women marry. And now I have no dowry, no prospects, no family to arrange anything. I am not sure what kind of future I have." Dominic set down his whittling and looked at her seriously. "The world you are talking about, the one with all those rules and expectations, you do not have to live in that world anymore. Out here, you can make your own rules. Be your own person. It is hard, and it is lonely sometimes, but it is also free." Caroline considered this, staring into the flames. Freedom was not something she had ever really considered before. Her whole life had been about meeting expectations, following rules, being the proper young lady her mother had raised her to be. But where had that gotten her? Abandoned by her own family, left to die in the wilderness with nothing to show for 22 years of good behavior and propriety. "Maybe you are right," she said softly. "Maybe it is time to make my own rules." Dominic smiled, and it transformed his entire face, softening the harsh lines and making him look younger. "That's the spirit. Now, get some rest. We have a long ride ahead of us tomorrow." They set out at dawn. Dominic's horse was a massive bay gelding named Thunder, with a chest like a barrel and legs thick as tree trunks. Caroline soon understood why he needed such a substantial mount. Even without her added weight, Dominic was probably close to 220 pounds of solid muscle. He lifted her into the saddle as if she weighed nothing, then swung up behind her with easy grace. Caroline found herself pressed back against his chest, his arms coming around her on either side to hold the reins. She could feel the heat of him, the solid strength of his body, and her heart did a strange little flip in her chest. "Comfortable?" he asked, his breath stirring the hair near her ear. "Yes," Caroline managed, though comfortable was not exactly the word she would have chosen. Acutely aware was more accurate. They rode north through terrain that grew increasingly rugged as the day wore on. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills covered in sagebrush and juniper, then to steeper slopes where pine trees began to appear. Dominic pointed out landmarks as they traveled, teaching her to read the land. "See that notch in the ridgeline? That marks the entrance to the canyon we will take tomorrow. And those scratches on that pine tree? Bear sign, probably from last spring. They like to mark their territory." Caroline absorbed every piece of information, fascinated by the depth of his knowledge. He moved through the wilderness with the confidence of someone who belonged there, reading signs in the dirt and the trees that she would never have noticed. They stopped for lunch beside a small creek, and Caroline was grateful for the chance to stretch her legs and splash cool water on her face. The ride was taking its toll on her still recovering body, but she refused to complain. Dominic had been nothing but kind, and she would not repay that kindness by being difficult. "You are doing well," Dominic said as they ate jerky and hardtack. "Most people from the settlements struggle with their first long ride in the mountains." "I am more tired than I want to admit," Caroline confessed, "but I will manage." "We can rest longer if you need to." "No, I would rather push on. The sooner we reach your cabin, the sooner I can properly rest." They rode through the afternoon, climbing steadily higher. The air grew cooler and thinner, scented with pine and the mineral smell of mountain stone. Caroline found herself relaxing into Dominic's presence, her initial self-consciousness fading as the hours passed. He kept up a steady stream of conversation, telling her stories about the mountains and the animals that lived there, asking her questions about her life before the journey west. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Dominic guided Thunder off the main trail and into a small clearing beside a rushing stream. "We will camp here tonight. The cabin is still another 6 hours' ride." Caroline slid down from the saddle, her legs shaky beneath her. Dominic caught her elbow, steadying her until she found her balance. "Thank you," she said, embarrassed by her weakness. "Nothing to thank me for. You've been sick. It takes time to get your strength back." While Dominic tended to Thunder and set up camp, Caroline gathered firewood and filled their canteens from the stream. It felt good to be useful, to contribute something to their journey. By the time full dark had fallen, they had a cheerful fire crackling and coffee brewing in a battered pot. This is beautiful," Caroline said, looking up at the stars that seemed impossibly bright and close in the thin mountain air. "I have never seen the sky like this." "Wait until you see it from the cabin," Dominic said. "We are high enough up there that you feel like you could reach out and touch the stars." They talked late into the night, sharing stories and slowly learning about each other. Caroline found herself laughing at Dominic's tales of mishaps and misadventures in the mountains, and she was surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. He listened with genuine interest when she spoke, never interrupting or dismissing her thoughts the way so many men did. When she finally lay down in her bedroll, with Dominic keeping watch by the fire, Caroline felt something she had not experienced in a long time, the sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They reached the cabin late the following afternoon. It sat in a high mountain meadow surrounded by towering pines, with a view that stretched for miles across forested valleys and distant peaks. The structure itself was more substantial than Caroline had expected, built from solid logs with a stone chimney and real glass in the windows. "You built this yourself?" Caroline asked as Dominic helped her down from Thunder. "Took me 2 years, working mostly in the summers. Winters up here are hard. You need a solid structure or you will not make it through." Inside the cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft above. There was a stone fireplace along one wall, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, shelves stocked with supplies, and a bed in the corner covered with what looked like bearskin. Everything was neat and well maintained, showing a care that surprised Caroline. "I know it is not much compared to what you are used to," Dominic said, setting her trunk down near the table. "It is wonderful," Caroline said honestly. "It feels like a home." Something in Dominic's expression softened. "I'm glad you think so. You can have the bed. I will sleep in the loft." "I cannot take your bed." "Yes, you can. You are still recovering, and the bed is more comfortable. Besides, I'm used to the loft." He held up a hand when she started to protest again. "Caroline, please, let me do this." She subsided, recognizing that same stubborn kindness that had led him to stay with her in the first place. "Thank you, Dominic, for all of this." "You are welcome. Now, how about I make us some proper dinner? I have venison steaks and potatoes, and I think there's even some canned peaches left from my last trip to Lovelock." As Dominic moved around the cabin preparing food, Caroline found herself watching him with something that went beyond gratitude. He moved with such confidence, such capability, and yet he was unfailingly gentle with her. She had never met anyone quite like him. Over the next weeks, they settled into a comfortable routine. Caroline's strength returned gradually, and as it did, she took on more of the household tasks. She cooked meals, mended clothes, organized the cabin, and helped Dominic preserve the meat from his hunts. In return, he taught her the skills she would need to survive in the mountains, how to identify edible plants, how to read the weather, how to shoot his rifle. "You have a steady hand," Dominic said one afternoon, as Caroline successfully hit the target he had set up behind the cabin. "Have you shot before?" "My father taught me when I was young. He said a woman needed to know how to protect herself." Carolyn lowered the rifle, feeling a pang at the memory. "I had not fired a gun in years before today." "Well, you have not lost the skill. Keep practicing. Up here, being able to shoot might save your life one day." As the weeks turned into a month, then 2, Caroline found her feelings for Dominic growing into something she had not expected. She noticed little things about him, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the gentleness in his voice when he woke her from nightmares, the careful way he always made sure she was comfortable and safe. He treated her with a respect she had rarely experienced, asking her opinions and listening to her ideas as if they mattered. And she could not deny the physical attraction, the way her pulse quickened when he stood close to her, the heat that flooded her cheeks when their hands accidentally touched, the dreams she had begun to have about what it might feel like if he kissed her. She tried to push these feelings down, knowing she was likely reading too much into his kindness, but they persisted stubbornly. One evening in early October, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Dominic turned to her with an unusual hesitancy in his manner. "Caroline, I need to talk to you about something." Her heart sank. This was it. He was going to tell her it was time for her to leave, that she had imposed on his hospitality long enough. Of course. "What is it?" "Snow will be coming soon, maybe another month or so before the first big storm. Once that happens, we will be snowed in here until spring. The pass is closed completely and it is too dangerous to travel." "I understand. I should start making arrangements to leave." The words hurt to say, but Caroline forced them out. "That is not what I'm saying." Dominic leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. "I'm asking if you want to stay. Through the winter. Maybe longer." Caroline's breath caught. "Stay? I know this is not the life you planned. This cabin is about as far from civilization as you can get, and winters are hard up here. But I have come to value your company, Caroline, more than I expected to. And I think maybe you have found some peace here too." "I have," Caroline whispered, "more than I ever thought possible." "Then stay, not as a guest but as a partner. We work well together. We could continue that way." There was something in his voice, a careful tone that suggested he was offering more than just a practical arrangement but was afraid to say it outright. Caroline's heart hammered in her chest as she tried to find the right words. "Dominic, I need to know something. These past months having me here, has it just been kindness on your part, repaying the debt you felt you owed to that Shoshone family?" He was quiet for a long moment, the fire crackling between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "At first, maybe. But Caroline, that changed within the first week. You have brought something back into my life that I thought died with my wife and son. Not to replace them, nothing could do that. But you have reminded me what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow, to want to share things with someone, to care about another person's happiness." "I feel the same way," Caroline said, her voice trembling. "I think I started falling in love with you somewhere between that first morning when you made me breakfast and the day you taught me to identify bear tracks. I tried not to. I told myself you were just being kind, that I was reading too much into it. But Dominic, I cannot help how I feel." The distance between them disappeared as Dominic rose and crossed to where she sat. He knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his much larger ones. "Caroline Dawson, I have been falling in love with you since the moment I saw you trying to be brave, even though you thought you were dying. You are the strongest, most resilient woman I have ever met, and I would be honored if you would stay here with me, not just for the winter, but for good." "Yes," Caroline breathed. "Yes, I will stay." Dominic reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the obvious strength in his fingers. "Can I kiss you?" Instead of answering, Caroline closed the distance between them and pressed her lips to his. The kiss started soft and tentative, but quickly deepened into something that made her entire body flush with heat. Dominic's arms came around her, pulling her close against his chest, and Caroline lost herself in the sensation of finally being held by someone who saw her, all of her, and wanted her anyway. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dominic rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I would feel this way again. I thought that part of my life was over." "Me too," Carolyn said. "I thought I would spend my life alone or married to someone I did not love out of necessity. But this is everything I never knew I wanted." They stayed up late into the night, talking and kissing and making plans for their future. Dominic wanted to marry her properly, which meant a trip to Lovelock once the weather permitted. Caroline found she wanted that too, wanted the official recognition of what they had found together. "We will go down in the spring," Dominic said. "Get married, stock up on supplies for next winter, maybe start thinking about some improvements to the cabin." "What kind of improvements?" "Well, if we are going to make this a proper home, we might need more space. A separate bedroom, maybe. Perhaps a workspace for you to do sewing. And eventually, if we are blessed with children, we would need room for them." Carolyn felt tears prick her eyes at the casual way he included her in his long-term plans, the way he spoke about a future with her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I would like that. All of it." That night, Dominic gave up the pretense of sleeping in the loft. Caroline moved into his arms in the big bed, and they held each other as the fire died down to embers. There was something profoundly right about being there with him, about the weight of his arm around her waist and the steady sound of his breathing. The first snow came in mid-November, a light dusting that made the meadow around the cabin look like something from a fairy tale. Carolyn stood at the window, watching the flakes fall, and felt Dominic come up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on top of her head. "Having second thoughts?" he asked. "It is not too late to change your mind. We could still get you down to Lovelock before the heavy snows hit." "Not a chance," Carolyn said firmly, turning in his arms to face him. "I am exactly where I want to be." Winter in the mountains was indeed hard, just as Dominic had warned. The snow piled up until it reached the cabin's windows, and there were days when the wind howled so fiercely that venturing outside was impossible. But inside the cabin, Caroline had never been happier. She and Dominic existed in their own small world, insulated from everything else by walls of snow and pine. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud from Dominic's small collection of books or teaching each other things. Carolyn showed him how to do fancier sewing techniques, while he taught her to carve wood and tan leather. They cooked together, cleaned together, and slowly learned each other's rhythms and habits. And they grew closer in every way. Caroline discovered that beneath Dominic's rough exterior was a man of surprising tenderness and passion. He treated her like she was precious, something to be cherished and protected, but he also respected her strength and independence. They argued sometimes, usually about small things like how much firewood to bring in or whether the rabbit stew needed more salt, but they always talked it through and found compromise. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside and the cabin warm from the fire, Dominic presented Caroline with a gift he had been secretly working on for weeks. It was a music box carved from pine and carefully polished until it gleamed. The lid depicted a mountain scene, complete with tiny trees and a cabin that looked remarkably like their own. "I do not have any music mechanism for it," Dominic said sheepishly, "but you could use it for jewelry or other small things. I wanted to give you something that would last." Caroline felt tears streaming down her face as she ran her fingers over the intricate carving. "It is beautiful. It is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me." "You are crying. Do you not like it?" "I love it. I am crying because I am happy, you fool." She set the box aside carefully and threw her arms around his neck. "I love you, Dominic Garrett. I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "I love you too," he murmured into her hair. "More than I thought possible." They made love that night with the fire crackling and snow falling softly outside, and Caroline felt as if she had finally found the place where she truly belonged. Winter eventually gave way to spring, and with the melting snow came the realization that they needed to make their trip to Lovelock. The journey down the mountain took 3 days, as the trails were muddy and treacherous with snowmelt. But Caroline did not mind. She rode pressed against Dominic's back, his arms around her, and felt a contentment that went bone deep. Lovelock was a small settlement, barely more than a trading post, a general store, a saloon, and a handful of houses clustered along the Humboldt River. But it had a circuit judge who came through once a month, and by great fortune, He was due to arrive the day after Caroline and Dominic rode in. They spent the night at the small boarding house in separate rooms to maintain propriety, though Caroline missed the warmth of Dominic beside her. The next morning, wearing the best dress she owned carefully preserved in her trunk and only slightly out of fashion, Caroline stood beside Dominic in front of Judge Morrison and spoke her vows. "I, Caroline Dawson, take you, Dominic Garrett, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." Dominic's voice was steady and sure as he repeated his own vows, his gray eyes never leaving hers. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Dominic kissed her with such tender passion that the small crowd of onlookers broke into applause. They spent 2 more days in Lovelock, purchasing supplies and enjoying the novelty of being around other people again. But by the 3rd morning, they were both eager to return to their mountain home. The settlement felt crowded and noisy after months in the peaceful solitude of the high country. The ride back was slower due to the loaded pack horse they had acquired, but Caroline did not mind. She was Caroline Garrett now, a married woman with a home and a husband who loved her. The future that had seemed so bleak just 6 months ago now stretched before her full of possibility. Summer in the mountains was glorious. The meadow around the cabin exploded with wildflowers, and the days were long and warm. Dominic began work on the addition to the cabin, expanding it to include a separate bedroom and a larger main room. Caroline helped where she could, learning to notch logs and mix chinking, though mostly she focused on their garden and preserving food for the next winter. They had visitors, occasionally trappers heading north, a Shoshone family passing through who remembered Dominic and welcomed Caroline warmly, even a few settlers looking for land. But mostly they had each other, and that was enough. One evening in late August, almost exactly a year after Caroline had been left behind by the wagon train, she sat on the porch of the cabin watching the sunset and reflecting on how much her life had changed. Dominic emerged from inside carrying 2 cups of coffee and settled beside her on the bench he had built. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, handing her one of the cups. "About how strange life is. A year ago, I was dying of fever, abandoned and alone, certain I would never see another sunrise. And now look at me. I have a home, a husband I love more than anything, and a life I never could have imagined." "Do you ever regret it? This life is hard, Caroline. We are isolated up here, far from any kind of civilization. You have given up any chance at the comfortable life you might have had." Caroline turned to look at him, this mountain man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "I regret nothing. That comfortable life you speak of would have meant marrying someone I did not love, living by rules that made me miserable, always feeling like I was not quite enough. Here with you, I am free. I am happy. I am exactly who I want to be." Dominic set down his coffee and pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Good, because I cannot imagine my life without you anymore." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Caroline thought about the wagon train that had left her behind, wondered briefly where those families were now, and if they ever thought about the woman they had abandoned. She found that she bore them no ill will anymore. Their choice, as cruel as it had seemed at the time, had led her to this moment, to this man, to this life. "Dominic," she said after a while, "I think I might be pregnant." She felt him go very still beside her. "Are you sure?" "Not completely, but I have missed my monthly courses twice now, and I have been feeling strange in the mornings. I wanted to wait to tell you until I was certain, but I could not keep it to myself any longer." Dominic pulled back to look at her face, his expression a mixture of hope and fear. "How do you feel about it?" "Terrified," Caroline admitted, "and excited, and hopeful, all at once. What about you?" "The same. I lost a son once, Caroline. The thought of going through that again frightens me more than I can say. But the thought of having a child with you, of building a family together, that is something I want very much." "Then we will be terrified and hopeful together," Caroline said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "We will figure it out as we go." Over the following months, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Caroline's pregnancy became undeniable. Her belly swelled, and Dominic became almost comically protective, barely letting her lift anything heavier than a teacup. Caroline found it both endearing and frustrating in equal measure. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she protested when he tried to stop her from carrying water from the well. "I know that. But humor me. Let me take care of you. You always take care of me. And I always will. Especially now." When the first snow fell in November, Caroline was 7 months along and feeling ungainly and enormous, but Dominic looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and that made all the discomfort worthwhile. They had prepared as best they could for the birth. Dominic had made a trip down to Lovelock in October and brought back medical supplies and a book about childbirth. They had also been fortunate enough to encounter the same Shoshone family from the summer, and the grandmother had given Caroline herbs and instructions on their use. "The baby will come when it is ready," the old woman had said through her grandson's translation. "You are strong. You will do well." Caroline clung to those words as her due date approached. They were completely snowed in now, just as they had been the previous winter. But this year felt different. This year they were waiting for a new life to join them, and the anticipation made everything feel more intense. The baby came on a bitter cold night in early January. Caroline's labor started just after dinner, and by midnight she was pacing the cabin, breathing through contractions while Dominic tried to remember everything he had read in the medical book. "You need to lie down," he said, his voice tight with worry. "I will lie down when I am ready," Caroline gasped. "Walking helps. Just stay with me. I am not going anywhere, I promise." The labor went on through the night and into the next day. Caroline had known it would be painful, but nothing could have truly prepared her for the reality of it. There were moments when she was certain she could not continue, when the pain seemed too much to bear. But Dominic was there through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, telling her how strong she was, how brave. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, with one final tremendous effort, Caroline felt the baby slip free. A thin, angry wail filled the cabin, and Dominic laughed with relief and joy. "It is a boy," he said, his voice thick with tears as he wrapped the baby in clean cloths. "Caroline, we have a son." He placed the tiny bundle in her arms, and Caroline looked down at the red, squalling infant with a love so fierce it took her breath away. He was perfect, from his shock of dark hair to his tiny fingers that gripped her thumb with surprising strength. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." Dominic knelt beside the bed, looking at his wife and son with an expression of such wonder and gratitude that Caroline felt tears streaming down her face. "What should we name him?" Dominic asked softly. Caroline had been thinking about this for months. "I want to name him after your first son, if that is all right. I know he can never replace the child you lost, but I want to honor his memory." Dominic's eyes filled with tears. "His name was Daniel, and Caroline, that would mean the world to me. Thank you." "Daniel Garrett," Caroline said, testing the name. "Welcome to the world, Daniel." The next months were the hardest and most rewarding of Caroline's life. Daniel was a healthy baby, but he required constant care and feeding. There were nights when Caroline was so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open, times when the baby's crying seemed endless, and she wondered if she was doing anything right. But Dominic was there through all of it, sharing the burden. He walked the floor with Daniel when Caroline needed to sleep, changed diapers without complaint, and looked at their son with such love and pride that Caroline fell in love with him all over again. Spring came eventually, bringing with it the end of their isolation. Daniel was 4 months old and thriving, and Caroline had regained most of her strength. Dominic began work on yet another addition to the cabin, this one a separate room for their son. "We are going to need more space if we plan to have more children," he said one morning as they sat on the porch watching Daniel sleep in his cradle. "More children?" Caroline raised an eyebrow. "You want more?" "If you do. I know it is hard and I would never pressure you. But yes, I would like Daniel to have siblings. I was an only child, and it was lonely at times." Caroline considered this, looking down at her sleeping son. The birth had been difficult, but holding Daniel in her arms made it all worthwhile. "I think I would like that too. Not right away, let me recover a bit more. But yes, Someday I would like to give Daniel brothers and sisters. They made their annual trip to Lovelock that summer, this time with Daniel strapped securely to Dominic's chest in a carrier the Shoshone grandmother had given them. The journey was slower with a baby, but they managed well enough. In town, they ran into the general store owner, who recognized Caroline from their wedding the previous year. "Mrs. Garrett, what a surprise, and who is this handsome little man?" "This is our son, Daniel," Caroline said proudly. "He is 5 months old." As they shopped and chatted with the few residents of Lovelock, Caroline could not help but reflect on how much had changed since the first time she had passed through this settlement. Then she had been weak and desperate, clinging to her aunt and uncle and terrified of the unknown future. Now she stood beside her husband, holding their son, confident and content in a way she had never been before. They were loading supplies onto their pack horse when a familiar face emerged from the saloon. Caroline froze, recognizing her uncle despite the passage of nearly 2 years. He looked older, more worn, and he stopped short when he saw her. "Caroline?" His voice was uncertain, disbelieving. "We thought you were dead." "I nearly was," Caroline said evenly, keeping her voice calm despite the anger that flared in her chest. "No thanks to you." Her uncle had the grace to look ashamed. "We had no choice. The fever, the delays, we had to think of everyone." "You abandoned your dead sister's daughter in the wilderness," Caroline said, and Dominic moved closer to her side in silent support. "You left me with barely enough supplies to survive for a week. That was your choice." "I know. And I have regretted it every day since. Your aunt, the guilt ate at her. She died last winter, still haunted by what we did." Caroline felt a pang of sympathy, but it was distant, muted by time and the life she had built. "I'm sorry for your loss, truly. But I cannot forgive what you did, Uncle. You could have fought for me, could have insisted the train wait just a few more days. Instead, you chose the easy path. I can see that you survived," her uncle said, his eyes taking in Dominic and the baby. "You have done well for yourself." "I have. Despite what you did, not because of anything you contributed." Caroline shifted Daniel to her other hip. "I have a husband who loves me, a son, a home. I have built a good life, and you have no part in any of it." She turned and walked away, Dominic at her side, and she did not look back. She felt him squeeze her hand in support, and she squeezed back, grateful for his presence. "Are you all right?" Dominic asked once they were out of town and on the trail back to the mountains. "I am," Caroline said, and realized she meant it. "I have been carrying anger about what they did for so long, but seeing him today, I realized that anger has no power over me anymore. I have everything I need. They gave up the chance to know me, to know Daniel. That is their loss, not mine." "I am proud of you," Dominic said. "It takes strength to let go of that kind of hurt. You taught me that. You showed me that the past does not have to define the future, that we can make our own happiness, even when the world seems determined to break us." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, Daniel sleeping peacefully against Dominic's chest. Caroline looked at her family, her husband and her son, and felt a contentment that went soul deep. This was her life now, and it was beautiful. The years flowed past like water in a mountain stream. Daniel grew from a baby into a curious, energetic toddler who kept Caroline and Dominic constantly busy. When he was 2, Caroline gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, and 2 years after that, another son they called James. The cabin grew along with their family. Dominic proved to be a skilled builder, adding rooms and improvements until their home was comfortable and spacious. He built furniture, crafted toys for the children, and never seemed to tire of working to make their lives better. Caroline developed a small business of her own, sewing clothes and quilts that Dominic would take to trade in Lovelock. Her work became known for its quality, and they were able to use the extra income to buy things they could not make themselves: books, tools, occasional luxuries like store-bought candy for the children. Life in the mountains was hard, but it was also rich with meaning. Caroline taught her children to read and write, using the small collection of books they had accumulated. Dominic taught them about the wilderness, how to track animals, identify plants, and survive in harsh conditions. The children grew up strong and confident, as comfortable in the forest as they were in the cabin. On Daniel's 7th birthday, as Caroline was tucking him into bed, he looked up at her with serious eyes that reminded her so much of Dominic. "Mama, Were you scared when you came to live in the mountains? Very scared, Caroline admitted. I did not know if I could survive out here. It was so different from everything I had known. But you did survive. You and Papa built all of this. We did. And do you know what I learned, Daniel? I learned that being scared does not mean you cannot do something. It just means you have to be brave and keep going anyway. Like when Papa told me about how you were sick and everyone left you? Caroline's heart clenched. She and Dominic had decided the children should know the truth of how their parents met, though they had softened some of the harsher details. Yes, like that. I was very sick and very alone, but your father found me and helped me. He taught me that I was stronger than I thought I was. I am glad he found you, Daniel said sleepily. Otherwise, we would not be here. I'm glad too, sweetheart. Now go to sleep. Tomorrow, Papa is going to teach you how to set rabbit snares. She kissed his forehead and moved to check on Margaret and James, both already fast asleep in their shared room. Looking at her children, Caroline felt the familiar swell of love and gratitude that had become her constant companion. She found Dominic on the porch, as he often was in the evenings, watching the stars emerge over the mountain peaks. Caroline settled beside him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "The children are asleep," he asked. Finally, Daniel asked me if I was scared when I first came here. What did you tell him? The truth, that I was terrified, but I did it anyway. Caroline leaned her head on Dominic's shoulder. Do you ever think about how different things could have been? If you had ridden past my wagon that day, or if I had tried to make it back to Lovelock on my own. Sometimes, Dominic admitted, and every time I am grateful for how things actually turned out. Finding you, Caroline, it saved me just as much as it saved you. I was existing up here, surviving, but I was not really living. You gave me a reason to live again, to hope again. We saved each other, Caroline said softly. That is what love does, I think. It saves us from ourselves, from our loneliness, from the darkness we carry. They sat together in the peace of the mountain evening, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant call of an owl. 3 children slept safely inside their cabin, the product of love and commitment, and the decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. More years passed, bringing changes and challenges. There was the winter when James nearly died of pneumonia, and Caroline and Dominic took turns sitting up with him for 5 terrifying nights before the fever finally broke. There was the summer when a grizzly bear destroyed part of their food cache, and they had to ration carefully to make it through the following winter. There was the year the creek flooded, and they lost half their garden, and the autumn when Dominic broke his leg, and Caroline had to manage the final harvest alone. But there were also moments of pure joy. The first time Daniel successfully hunted a deer on his own, his pride and excitement making Dominic's eyes shine with tears. Margaret's beautiful singing voice, discovered one evening when she thought no one was listening. James's talent for carving, inherited from his father and refined through hours of practice. The nights when they would all sit around the fire, telling stories and laughing until their stomachs hurt. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dominic surprised Caroline by taking her on a 2-day trip to a high alpine lake he had discovered years ago. They left the children with a trusted friend who had homesteaded in a valley about 10 miles south and rode into the high country alone for the first time in years. The lake was breathtaking, a jewel of perfect blue water surrounded by granite peaks and meadows full of wildflowers. They camped on its shore, and that night, under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch, they made love with the passion and tenderness that had only deepened over the years. "Thank you for this," Caroline said afterward, lying in Dominic's arms beneath their blankets. "For bringing me here, for these 10 years, for everything." "Thank you for staying," Dominic replied, "for choosing this life, for choosing me. I know it has not always been easy." "The best things never are," Caroline said. "But Dominic, I have never regretted it, not for a single moment. You and the children, you are my whole world. And you are mine." They stayed at the lake for 2 glorious days, talking and swimming and simply enjoying being alone together. It reminded them both of why they had fallen in love in the first place, underneath the responsibilities and challenges of daily life. When they returned home, Caroline felt refreshed and reconnected to the man she had married. The children tackled them both with hugs and questions about the trip, and as Caroline looked around at her family, her home, her life, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. The children grew older, and with age came new challenges. Daniel, at 15, began talking about wanting to see more of the world, to travel beyond the mountains that had been his entire universe. Margaret, 13 and beautiful, attracted the attention of the few young men in the scattered homesteads around them, giving Dominic gray hairs as he played the protective father. James, at 11, was still content to stay close to home, but Caroline knew that would change eventually. "They are going to leave us, aren't they?" Caroline said one night, voicing the fear that had been growing in her heart. "Not now, but someday. They will want their own lives." "Of course they will," Dominic said gently. "That is what we are raising them to do. To be independent, capable people who can make their own choices. We cannot hold them here forever, Caroline, no matter how much we might want to." "I know, but it is hard. This place, this life, it means everything to me. The thought that they might not want it breaks my heart a little. They might not want exactly this, but we have given them the tools to build whatever life they choose, and we have shown them what real love looks like, what a true partnership is. That is worth more than any land or cabin." Caroline knew he was right, but it did not make the thought of her children leaving any easier. Still, she focused on enjoying the time they had, creating memories that would last long after the children built their own lives. Daniel did eventually leave at 17, heading to California to see the cities and the ocean. It nearly tore Caroline's heart out to watch him ride away, but she held her tears until he was out of sight. He came back 2 years later, full of stories and experiences, and announced that he wanted to homestead in the valley where their friend lived, to build his own place, but stay close to family. Margaret married at 19 to a young man from Lovelock who made her laugh and treated her with the kind of respect Dominic had modeled. They settled on a piece of land about 20 miles west, close enough to visit but far enough to have their own life. James, true to his quiet nature, stayed on at the cabin longer, helping Dominic with the endless work of mountain living. Caroline found herself experiencing a bittersweet mix of pride and sadness as her children built their own lives. She and Dominic were no longer the center of their universe, and that was as it should be, but it still hurt in ways she had not anticipated. "We did it," Dominic said one evening as they sat on the porch, now aged and weathered but still solid. They were in their 40s now, no longer young but not yet old, their bodies showing the marks of hard living but still strong. "We raised 3 good people who know how to survive and thrive and love. That is an accomplishment, Caroline. I know, I am proud of them, proud of us. It is just the cabin feels so empty now." "It does, but that means we get to rediscover each other, like when we first started. Just you and me, the way it was in the beginning." Caroline turned to look at her husband, seeing the gray threading through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes from years of squinting into mountain sun, the strength that still defined his frame despite the passing years. He was still the most handsome man she had ever seen, still the person she wanted beside her more than anyone else in the world. "You know what?" she said. "I think I like that idea. Just you and me." They had another decade of that precious time, of rediscovering the intimacy and partnership that had first brought them together. James eventually married and moved to his own homestead. Daniel gave them 3 grandchildren. Margaret had 2. The cabin that had once been full of children's laughter now hosted family gatherings where grandchildren ran wild through the meadow while the adults caught up on news and shared meals. Caroline developed a slight limp from an old injury, and Dominic's hands grew stiff with the beginnings of arthritis. But they adapted, helping each other with tasks that became more difficult, never complaining about the small indignities of aging. They had each other, and that was enough. On a summer evening, sitting on the porch they had sat on hundreds of times before, Caroline took Dominic's hand and squeezed it gently. "I have been thinking about that day," she said, "the day the wagon train left me behind. I used to think it was the worst thing that ever happened to me." "And now?" Dominic asked, though the smile on his face suggested he already knew the answer. "Now I think it was the best thing, because it brought me to you. It gave me this life, this family, this home. I would not change a single thing, Dominic, not one moment of fear or pain or hardship, because it all led here. I feel the same way. Every step of my journey, all the loss and wandering and loneliness, it was all leading me to that wagon where you lay sick and abandoned, to the moment I decided to stay instead of ride past. That decision changed everything. We changed everything, Caroline corrected. Together. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. 5 grandchildren were asleep inside the cabin, visiting for the summer while their parents worked on their homesteads. Tomorrow morning would be full of noise and energy and chaos, but right now, in this perfect moment, it was just Caroline and Dominic, the mountain and the sky, and the deep contentment of a life well lived. "Do you ever wonder what happened to the people on that wagon train?" Caroline asked. "If they made it to California, if they prospered there?" "Sometimes, but not often. Our story was never really about them, was it? It was about 2 people finding each other when they both needed it most. About choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. About building something real and lasting in a harsh and unforgiving world." "That is exactly what it was about," Caroline agreed, and what a beautiful story it turned out to be. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first nights together, their wedding, the births of their children, and all the years in between, Caroline thought about the young woman she had been. That frightened, sick girl who had been left to die in the Nevada desert could never have imagined the life she would build, the love she would find, the family she would create. The settlers had voted to leave her behind, thinking they were condemning her to death. Instead, they had freed her to find her true home. And the mountain man who had stayed with her, who had chosen kindness over convenience, had become her partner in every sense of the word. They traveled together through life, through joy and sorrow, through hardship and triumph, and they built something that would last long after they were gone. Their children and grandchildren would carry forward the lessons they had learned, the strength they had shown, the love they had shared. It was not the life Caroline had planned, but it was the life she was meant to have. And as she sat on that porch with her husband's hand in hers, surrounded by mountains and memories, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found exactly where she belonged. Years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of seasons in the mountains. Winter snows gave way to spring blooms, which yielded to summer warmth, which faded into autumn gold. Caroline and Dominic settled into the comfortable patterns of a long marriage, their movements synchronized through decades of partnership. They were in their mid-50s when Dominic began having pains in his chest. He tried to hide it at first, not wanting to worry Caroline, but she knew him too well to be fooled. She insisted they make the trip to Lovelock, which had grown over the years into a proper town with a doctor. Dr. Patterson, a young man who had moved west from Boston, examined Dominic thoroughly and delivered his verdict with professional sympathy. "Your heart is weak, Mr. Garrett. It is not uncommon in men who have lived hard lives. You need to take things easier, avoid strenuous activity." "I live in the mountains," Dominic said flatly. "There is no such thing as avoiding strenuous activity." "Then you need to consider moving somewhere else, down here to town perhaps, where life is easier." Caroline and Dominic looked at each other, and the message passed between them without words. They would not leave their mountain. "Thank you for your advice, Doctor," Caroline said politely. "We will consider our options." On the ride back to the cabin, they talked about what the diagnosis meant. Dominic was determined to continue, as he always had, but Caroline insisted on compromise. He would teach James, now 22 and visiting frequently, to handle more of the heavy work. They would prepare for the possibility that Dominic might not have as many years left as they had hoped. "I am not ready to lose you," Caroline said, her voice breaking despite her attempt to stay calm. "And I am not planning to go anywhere anytime soon," Dominic replied, pulling Thunder to a stop so he could turn and look at her properly. "But Caroline, when my time comes, I want you to know something. These years with you have been the happiest of my life. You took a broken man living alone in the mountains and made him whole again. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to wake up every morning. I have no regrets." "Do not talk like that. You are going to live for many more years. We are going to grow old together, meet our great-grandchildren, celebrate our golden anniversary." "I hope so. But if we do not, promise me you will be all right. Promise me you will keep living, keep finding joy. Do not lock yourself away in grief the way I did after Elizabeth died. Caroline pressed her face against his broad back and held on tight. I promise. But you have to promise me you will fight. You will take care of yourself, listen to your body, and not be stubborn about asking for help. I promise. They kept both promises. Dominic was more careful about his limitations, accepting help from James and Daniel when the work was too demanding. Carolyn learned even more about wilderness medicine, concocting teas and tonics that seemed to help with the chest pains. They cherished their time together, making the most of every day. 3 years after the diagnosis, they celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary with all 3 of their children, their spouses, and all 8 grandchildren gathered at the cabin. It was crowded and chaotic and absolutely perfect. Carolyn looked around at the family they had created, at the legacy of love they had built, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep scattered throughout the cabin and in tents outside, Carolyn and Dominic took one last walk through the meadow by moonlight. The summer air was cool and sweet with the scent of wildflowers, and the stars overhead blazed with impossible brightness. This place, Dominic said, looking around at the mountains that had been his home for over 40 years. This is where I want to rest eventually, right here in this meadow where I can become part of the mountain. That's a long time from now, Caroline said firmly. Maybe, or maybe not. But whenever it is, I want you to know that I'm at peace with it. I've had a good life, Caroline. The best life. They stood together in the moonlight, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from nothing. The mountain stood eternal and unchanging around them, witness to their love story, guardian of their home. Dominic lived for another 7 years, good years filled with grandchildren and laughter and the quiet contentment of a life well lived. His heart finally gave out on a crisp autumn morning while he was sitting on the porch watching the sun rise over the peaks. He died peacefully in the place he loved most, with Caroline holding his hand. The grief was crushing, even though Caroline had known it was coming. She felt as if part of her soul had been ripped away, leaving a wound that would never fully heal. But she had promised Dominic she would keep living, and Caroline Garrett was a woman who kept her promises. Her children wanted her to move down to live with one of them, but Caroline refused. The mountain was her home. This cabin held 40 years of memories, and she would not abandon it. James and his wife moved into the valley cabin that Daniel had built years ago, close enough to check on Caroline daily while still giving her independence. Caroline lived alone in the cabin for another 12 years, tending her garden, sewing quilts for her growing collection of great-grandchildren, and taking daily walks through the meadow where Dominic was buried beneath a simple stone marker. She talked to him often, sharing news of the family, telling him about her day, asking his advice on problems even though she knew she would get no answer. But sometimes, when the wind blew through the pines in a certain way, or the sunset painted the sky in his favorite colors, she felt his presence. Not a ghost exactly, but a sense of connection that transcended death. They had promised each other forever, and Caroline believed that forever was exactly what they would have. She was 70 years old when she slipped in the cabin one winter morning and broke her hip. James found her hours later, and though he rushed her down to Lovelock where the now elderly Dr. Patterson treated her, they all knew what it meant. At her age, with such an injury, recovery was unlikely. Carolyn lasted 3 weeks, long enough for all her children and many of her grandchildren to gather around her bed in the Lovelock Hospital. She was ready to go, had been ready since the morning Dominic died. She had stayed because she had promised she would, because her family needed her, because there was still love to give and life to live. But now, with her body failing and her children grown with families of their own, she felt the pull of whatever came next. She hoped it was somewhere she would find Dominic again, though she did not know if she believed in heaven. She just knew that a love like theirs did not end with death. It could not. On her last morning, with pale winter sunlight streaming through the window, Caroline gathered her children close. "Dears, I want you to know how proud I am of all of you," she said, her voice weak but clear. "You have built good lives, raised good families. You have honored what your father and I tried to teach you." "We learned from the best," Daniel said, his voice thick with tears. Remember the mountain? Caroline continued. Remember the cabin in the meadow and all the years we spent there together. That is where your roots are, where your story began. Never forget that. We won't, Mama, Margaret promised, and we will make sure your grandchildren and great-grandchildren know the story. How Papa found you when you had been left behind, how he stayed with you, how you built a life together in the wilderness. It is a story worth remembering. It is, Caroline agreed, her eyes growing heavy. It is a love story, the best kind. She closed her eyes then, drifting into sleep, and sometime in the early afternoon, with her children holding her hands and snow falling softly outside the window, Caroline Garrett took her last breath. They buried her in the meadow next to Dominic, just as she had requested. The family gathered on a cold February day to lay her to rest, and they told stories about her strength, her kindness, her courage, about how she had been abandoned by one family and built another, about how she had taken a hard life in a harsh land and made it beautiful through sheer force of will and love. Years passed, and the cabin stood empty for a while before Daniel's grandson decided to restore it. He brought it back to life, modernizing it enough for comfort while preserving its essential character. The cabin became a family gathering place, somewhere all the descendants of Carolyn and Dominic could come to connect with their history. The story of how their ancestors met, of the wagon train that voted to leave Caroline behind, and the mountain man who chose to stay with her, became family legend. It was told to children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and beyond. The details might have varied slightly with each telling, but the core truth remained the same. It was a story about kindness and courage, about choosing love over convenience, about staying when leaving would have been easier, about two people who found each other when they both needed saving, and who built something lasting from that chance encounter. The mountain stood eternal, keeping watch over the meadow where two stone markers weathered slowly in the wind and snow. Wildflowers bloomed there every summer, and sometimes, when family gathered at the cabin, they would walk out to that spot and stand in silence, paying respect to the love that had started it all. Caroline Dawson had been left behind by the settlers, deemed expendable and abandoned to die. But Dominic Garrett had seen her worth when others did not. He had stayed with her, and they had traveled together through life, building a family and a legacy that would endure long after both of them were gone. It was not the story either of them would have chosen when they were young, but it was the story they were meant to have, and in the end, it was perfect.